pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hey, so, the picture, the guy on the left, Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister. The book cover on the right, Clearing the Plains. Please stay tuned for my full review. And please hang on until the very end for a statuesque finish to this video. Hello BookTube, I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with a review of a work of Canadian history, Clearing the Plains, Disease, Politics of Starvation, and the Loss of Aboriginal Life by James Daschuk. Originally published about 10 years ago, I think. Not quite. Published in 2013. I've had it sitting on my shelf for a few years and finally read it as a buddy read with Jay Shea in the last couple months. I have not read a work of history that has had such an emotional impact on me. This is about how the land was cleared that my ancestors, among tens and hundreds of thousands of other settlers, homesteaded or farmed, put down roots, raised families, starting in the maybe late 1880s in Saskatchewan. I studied Saskatchewan history in about grade 6, and what a lot of hooey that was. Oh my god. There was nothing about any of this in what I learned. It's not like the broad outlines of this were not familiar to me. I was very lucky to be raised in a progressive family who were farmers and were also socially conscious and became more. So everybody, as society changes, people evolve. But I remember when I was, was I a teenager? Maybe I was a teenager, but I think I was about 12, and I remember Dad was inside some shop, and Mom and my sister and I were waiting in the car, and I don't know what Mom had been reading. I don't know if it just came to her spontaneously, but she said to us, the white man didn't treat the Indians here in Canada very well, and we are living on their land. And it was a very short little talk without any historical data. It was just a mother expressing perhaps the dawning of her own consciousness about this in the 1970s that has stayed with me. So it's a long walk from that bee that my mom put in my bonnet to what I discovered in these pages. I will say at the outset that it's not the best written book. I hope to make you interested enough that you are willing to wade through the chapters that maybe some of them could have been shorter, certainly could have been better organized. But once you get through the introductory chapters, which kind of set the historical and epidemiological foundations for the main event, which is what happened in the territory which became Saskatchewan, in order to clear the land of its Indigenous peoples, force them into reserves where most of them still live 150 years later. It was a crime against humanity. Canada was founded on corrupt, evil, corporate lies and misdeeds. Canada was a bad idea. A lot happened with the Indigenous peoples in the prairies, in which unfortunately later became Canada, long before all that happened, and he perhaps goes into too much detail about that in the first 4, 5, 6 chapters, or could have organized it better so that it was more clear. But certainly the introduction and the conclusion give some solidity to what is a little bit shapeless in those early chapters, and I'm not going to spend any time in this review talking about that other than that to say epidemics played a central role in the history of what became Canada for centuries before Canada came into existence. And there was a huge virgin soil smallpox epidemic in what is now Saskatchewan in the late 18th century. Virgin soil epidemic, I found out from this book, is when an infectious disease, a contagious disease, is introduced to a population that has no immunity to it. And that was because of the explorers and fur traders and whatnot. Such that the original populations of Indigenous peoples that lived there were almost completely wiped out by the epidemic. And what was left of the Cree population was so fragmented and decimated that they reconstituted, another word I learned in this book, ethnogenesis. They reconstituted themselves ethnically and culturally and created a completely new tribal identity, the Plains Cree. And that all happened at the end of the 18th century. So the main thing to stay aware of is that in the middle of the 19th century, because of their regular daily diet of bison meat, the Indigenous peoples on Western Canada were the tallest people on the planet. They were the healthiest, strongest, tallest people on the planet in the middle of the 19th century. And by the end of the 19th century, most of them were starving to death and sick with diseases that were a byproduct of colonialism. And that history is told here. And I don't want to exaggerate the fact that it's not well written, because a whole bunch of this, especially the central historical period that he focuses on from about 1870 to the 1890s, it's gripping and horrific. Sir John A. Macdonald is Canada's first Prime Minister. He was the Prime Minister at the founding of Canada in 1867, and then he was voted out of office in some conservative scandal. Some things never change. But he was re-elected in sometime in the 1870s. I had the exact date in my mind, but it's gone. But sometime in the 1870s, he came back into power and instituted the national policy, which was to construct a railroad across Canada to British Columbia in the west. Just a few years before, Canada had purchased Rupert's Land, which was the bulk of what is now Canada. Up until then, Canada was just a couple of piddly portions of what is now Ontario and Quebec. There wasn't much, maybe some maritime provinces. Only British Columbia. Before the Rupert's Land purchase, here's a map. That's how much of what is now Canada that they bought from the Hudson's Bay Company. So, I mean, Canada originated out of corporate malfeasance, greed. So Canada newly acquired all this territory. He wanted to plow a railroad through it for the first time, and he had to get the Aboriginal peoples out of the way. And he also wanted to settle the West with farmers. Again, he had to get the Indigenous peoples out of the way. So he started negotiating treaties with them, and not in good faith. All of that is detailed here. It just made me so angry to read about that. The negotiations, one group, Treaty Number 4, I think it was, had the good sense to negotiate in a clause that they would require assistance in the event of a famine, because they foresaw that the bison were about to disappear from the plains, and they did within 18 months. I don't want to say too much about what happened, other than that Prime Minister, who also appointed himself the Indian Affairs Minister, so that he could take control of this file, he let the Aboriginal peoples starve and forced them to sign treaties that were not negotiated in good faith if they wanted food. And so that's why most of them signed. And then in the ensuing decades, they were pushed onto reserves with subpar infrastructure, education, healthcare services. The daily allotment of food, I think in about 1880, was a cup of flour and 4 ounces of meat per person, and then it was cut in half a few years later. So they were malnourished, many of them on reserve, starved to death. Meanwhile, waves of epidemics of preventable diseases like tuberculosis, because they were fed subpar rotting meat from cows that had tuberculosis. If I say it in any more details, I would probably start screaming. And because the colonialist Department of Indian Affairs officials had such control over whether these poor peoples lived or died, the sexual exploitation of the Indigenous women was the beginning of what continues to this day of Canadians raping and sexually torturing and murdering Indigenous women. Canada's history is a murderous affair indeed, and this phase makes me ashamed to be Canadian. So we've got to fix it, but part of fixing it is understanding it. So just to wrap up, because I'm getting too upset, it's just a fucking nightmare what we have done to Indigenous peoples. I hope they get all the land back in court fight after court fight. I don't know exactly when the study was done, and I don't have the stats memorized, but what I'm going to say is close enough to the truth that it is the truth. Studies of the white settler population of Saskatchewan our lifespan and our income and all the things about quality of life, we rank within the top 10 of other jurisdictions around the world. And the same survey applied to the Indigenous population living on reserves in Saskatchewan, and I'm talking about a recent survey in the last decade or so. They are 73rd in the world, so they're at about the same level as the poor people of Romania. And this book shows how all that started and how compromised health and starvation was used as a tool of the colonial state to clear the plains so that my ancestors could settle there and bloom, prosper, and multiply. It was disgusting. We lived with the injustice generation after generation, and what came after the period that this book narrates was just as obscene, if not more obscene. The residential schools and so many other genocidal colonialist atrocities that Canada has committed against the peoples we displaced. If you want more, this book has it. For this particular Saskatchewanian, this particular Canadian, I don't live in Canada at the moment, but I certainly was born and raised in Saskatchewan. This book has forever altered the way that I will be relating to those aspects of my identity, and I hope that I will become part of the solution, because, boy, is there a lot of injustices to compensate for or in other ways address. I hope I gave you an inkling of what it has to offer. Thanks for watching.
Abolish the police! Abolish the police!